Hello, Mr. Small. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here. Before we get started, Mr. Small, can you please tell me a little bit about yourself and your current projects, especially when it relates to China?
Sure. So I work at the German Marshall Fund as a senior fellow. I've been with them since 2006, working in various dimensions of US-China policy, European-China policy, most of the time covering an array of different dimensions of Chinese foreign policy, and particularly Chinese foreign and economic policy in South Asia over the last 10 years or so. As it relates to the topic today, I wrote a book on the China-Pakistan relationship. I've done a lot of work on China and Afghanistan. I've been in DC for 10 years, but I'm in Berlin at the moment, and looking very closely at these issues right now, as well as all the other dimensions of particularly the US, Europe, China dynamics on various topics.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. So can you please first give us a little bit background information on China's economic and geopolitical interests in the region, especially the kind of changes that we can expect after the United States withdrawal from the area?
So the fact that you formulate the question as the region rather than Afghanistan, I think is quite important, because China does have significant economic, political, strategic interests in the wider region. In Afghanistan, I think they're much narrower, and this relates then to the security concerns that China has in the aftermath of the US withdrawal. For instance, the economic interests in Afghanistan that are in theory speculated about as being, the prodigious resources under the ground, connection to the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these sorts of things, I think in the scheme of things are relatively minimal. I think China knows how difficult it is to be able to extract the resources, the sorts of large-scale investments that would be required, the infrastructure involved, in a country that has been at war for the last few decades. And I think China's also, when it even comes to questions like Belt and Road, more basic infrastructure connections, China doesn't even have cross-border infrastructure connections with Afghanistan. It's kept as a sealed border, and it's kept as a sealed border for a good reason. I think China tends to see Afghanistan more as a place where you need to contain the threats and contain the risks than really a place where there's such great opportunities. Places where China does have more significant economic and political interests across the region, Pakistan, Central Asia, these cases where there are Chinese workers on the ground, there are tens of billions of dollars of investments. These are then the places that I think China's particularly concerned about in the aftermath. They were concerned, of course, about the spillover effects that there might have been if we plunged into an even deeper civil war, but they've seen what happens when the Taliban were in power before. They have a working relationship with them going back to that time, but they're still nervous about what an Islamist regime next door does when it comes to the kind of permissive environment for militants in the region that China's seen in Taliban-controlled territory ever since. As well as the time that they were actually in government. So I think there's still a fair degree of nervousness, not just about that and the kind of classic cases of Uyghur militants operating in Afghanistan, but also some of the groups like the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, that have had such a destabilizing effect on China's closest partner in the region, Pakistan. And on all of these questions, China's putting particular stress in its exchanges with the Taliban that it does have to break with these groups, it does have to prevent them from using Afghan soil to launch cross-border attacks, all of these sorts of things. So China does, of course, want to see some kind of stable political settlement in Afghanistan. And further down the line, it may have more significant interest there, even on the economic side too. But in the short term, it's just managing a very different set of risks and threats than the ones that it thought it was facing when you had the US military presence.
I see. And speaking of sort of China's relationship with the area, another topic that I've seen popping up on social media is its effect, especially its psychological effect on Taiwan. How would the situation change for Taiwan?
I mean, the purpose of the drawdown in Afghanistan connects to a much wider rebalancing that's been underway pretty much since the Obama administration, to say that land wars in Asia, counterinsurgency, this entire framework that's governed US foreign policy since 9/11 needs to make way for great power competition, the maritime Indo-Pacific, and concentrating more directly on China. This is intended, I think, and President Biden's been very clear about this, as a means of ensuring that the United States can reprioritize particularly on partners and allies in Asia. So although there's an obvious kind of propaganda benefit from the disastrous manner in which the US has conducted this withdrawal and the awful scenes that we're seeing at the moment, including for a lot of US partners who in country who had expected that the US was going to stick around, this is in a certain way the US pulling back to the regions and theaters that it thinks are most critical for US foreign policy, security, and economic interests. And that doesn't look like the kind of the greater Middle East in the way that the US thought it did. But when it comes to Taiwan, Taiwan is squarely in the middle of that new framework, and a framework in Asia that I think is going to be the primary focus of US defense, economic, foreign policy for a long time to come. So I would, on the Chinese side, I think there'll be, on the one hand, yes, there's some propaganda value to be made from the kind of handling of this with allies, the manner of the withdrawal. But I think this is also something that Asian allies had been urging the US to do for a long time. They thought the US was bogged down and distracted with these wars. In fact, China thought that the US was bogged down and distracted by these wars, which is precisely why it doesn't want to get sucked into Afghanistan itself.
Right. I see. Fantastic. And I think you briefly alluded to this also relates to the situation in Xinjiang, and which is sort of one of the primary concerns of China, when it comes to this region.
As you would have seen from the exchanges between Wang Yi and the Taliban, one of the Taliban leaders, Mullah Baradar, right. The Xinjiang issue is still very, very high on the bilateral agenda. If you go back to the meetings that took place at the turn of the millennium between Chinese officials and Mullah Omar, it was then too. And back then, the concern was essentially the Taliban hosting what was then ETIM camps on their territory, and putting the Taliban under pressure to disavow them. I mean, preferably, they would have liked them to do more, but at least to prevent them from running their independent network of camps in the country. But this has been a concern ever since. In practice now, Xinjiang is so locked down that the cross-border risks, even from Central Asia, are pretty minimal. And they're, of course, incredibly minimal when it comes to any infiltration across the Wakhan corridor, which is essentially impossible given how secure that border is. But even in terms of kind of information flows and things into Xinjiang, ideological, materials, anything like this, that's just not really happening. So I think the concern is not necessarily about Xinjiang proper. It's rather about the fact that you do have Uyghur fighters operating in Afghanistan. There are a lot of soft Chinese targets in the neighborhood. One of the worst attacks that took place in Pakistan at any point on Chinese workers took place relatively recently, and whether accurately or not, it was attributed to TIP working in conjunction with TTP. And again, whether some of these things are strictly accurate, I think the concern is there are these individuals, they have launched attacks on Chinese targets, typically overseas. I think there's very little threat to the mainland, but China is going to be worried about that dimension. But they also don't want the Taliban taking up the Xinjiang issue. They've done a pretty effective job of squashing the issue among Muslim leaders, Muslim majority countries, even a number of Islamic religious leaders and things. So the concern would also be that that it gets taken up in the way that, in a certain modest way, for instance, Islamic State did at least take up the issue, and in a way that Al-Qaeda didn't, Taliban didn't before. So I think they also want to contain this in international terms? How is this viewed across the network of Islamic militancy, generally speaking? So that dimension of it matters. But I think the direct spillover effects, whatever happens next door in Afghanistan, I think would just be incredibly minimal. Of course, it's beneficial, generally speaking, over a longer arc if you have a prosperous neighborhood for Xinjiang. And so if you have unstable neighbors on every single border as a result of developments there, then that's going to be costly in different ways. But I think the direct militant links to Xinjiang itself are derisory or virtually non-existent.
I see. Thank you so much for the information. Final question of the day. How does all this affect President Biden, or more generally the United States political capital in the world, especially in the eyes of allies, but also in the eyes of adversaries?
I mean, I think we're in a transition at the moment. This is the kind of the long arc of US foreign policy since 9/11, that there's been the strategic focus that there's been for so long, I think is now moving into a new phase, some of which was already underway during the Trump administration. We've had similar views about the land wars in Asia question. We have seen a big rebalancing in the US strategic community to say that the Indo-Pacific, China, the great power competition should be the focal points. So it's kind of a delicate moment, though, because not all the allies have been brought on board on that. Yes, there are allies and partners in Asia who think this is right, but if you look at Europe, if you look at parts of the Middle East, you look at a number of places, they would still have liked the US to kind of at least hold on to some of the ideals that it had espoused when it came to the fate of Afghanistan, the Afghan people. There are a lot of people at the moment who feel burned, betrayed even by what's gone on. There's incredibly sharp language being used around this. There were a lot of partners and allies who committed to this mission over time, and the manner in which it's ending and the way it's even being talked about is eliciting clearly some very negative responses, even emotional responses about this, because I think there was a kind of implied moral commitment that came along with this mission. And so many people have been personally invested in this, have served there in the military, have been journalists there, have friends and close connections. This is quite different from some of the other kind of wars that have come to an end in the era that we've seen. And I'm not sure that the White House was fully prepared to kind of make the case for what they were doing in the way that they needed to. But fundamentally, this is part of a longer-term trajectory in US foreign policy, where not just the allies in Asia, but partners and allies in Europe as well, are having to adjust to this new paradigm. This is a US that in certain ways we haven't seen in the post-Cold War era, because it's also a US that's prioritizing. For a long time in a unipolar framework, the US was able to do everything everywhere. Now they're asking even more of partners, and they're having to pick where they channel their resources. And there are going to be some beneficiaries from that, and I think they're largely going to be in Asia. But there are going to be a lot of people that are nervous about whether they find themselves on the wrong side of the line. But I think even on the European side, as we saw in the interview with Biden last night, when it comes to these core commitments to the places that the US has its closest economic and security links, they're going to continue. People know that. So I think there is some short-term cost on this, and there is some real adjustment required, I think, on people's part to what this kind of new focus on great power competition amounts to. But in the end, I think the sense on the US government side was that at some stage you are going to have to kind of go through the final stages of this process and push on, because as long as you have troops there, as long as you have commitments, it's always going to consume attention in Washington, and it's always going to leave the issues around China and in Asia in the kind of important but not urgent category, in a way that Afghanistan and the Middle East are always very good at falling into the urgent category, given the immediacy of some of the security threats. So it was going to be difficult whenever. It was just particularly badly handled, and I think there's no question about that. And that has some costs in terms of perceived competence as well. But I think the issues at stake on this really go well beyond just the question of competence around the way the withdrawal was handled.
I see. Thank you so much. This is such a helpful conversation, and we'll make sure to include a link to your book in the show notes section, so people who are interested in reading more about your work can go ahead and take a look. Thank you so much, Mr. Small. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.